it okay to begin? Okay. Okay. All right. Is it okay? All right, will do. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for waiting. Welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. My name is Eric Johnston. I am an FCCJ regular member as well as a member of the Professional Activities Committee, which is sponsoring today's press conference. Today, it is an honor, a privilege, and a pleasure to welcome three speakers to talk about the Ainu-Nation lawsuit and the struggles of indigenous peoples in other countries to gain their maritime rights. To my immediate right is Russ Jones, Hereditary Chief of the Haida Nation in Canada. Beside him is Aslak Holmberg, President of the Saami Council in Finland. And then finally, from the Raporo Ainu-Nation in Hokkaido, the President, Mr. Masaki Sashima. We're going to begin with a presentation by Mr. Sashima. And sir, if you could please keep it to around maybe 10 minutes or so, that would be most helpful. Okay, once the interpreter is ready, of course.
Yes.
Thank you for coming. Okay, so, Sashima-san?
はい。
はい、よろしくお願いします。
よろしくお願いします。私はラポロアイヌネーションの佐島正樹と申します。現在、私たちは国と北海道に対してアイヌ古来の権利であります鮭の捕獲権を鮭の捕獲権の確認を求めるよう訴えております。しかし、国も北海道も私たちの古来の権利、明治時代より前はずっと持っていた権利については、あるともないとも言っておりません。それで現在の法律に照らして、私たちには国際的にはどこの国でも持っている先住民族の先住権については、現在の日本の法律に照らし合わせて、それは存在しない、全く存在しないと言っております。それで、私たちラポロアイヌネーションは、世界的な例、カナダではどうなのか、フィンランドではどうなのか、それを私たちの地元で世界の先住民の皆様に自分たちの先住権について話してもらおう。それで世界の先住民の先住権の様子を私たちの地元で話してもらおうということで招待申し上げました。
そろそろ訳しましょうか。
はい。
Thank you very much for this opportunity. My name is Sashima Masaki, and I represent Raporo Ainu-Nation. We at Raporo Ainu-Nation have been taking on both the national government and Hokkaido government regarding our inherent indigenous fishing rights, that is to catch salmon. We are trying to have the governments confirm these rights through the litigation. This is the indigenous inherent fishing rights that our ancestors used to enjoy up until the Meiji period. And at this point, the governments are not saying whether they exist or not. However, that is according to the present Japanese laws. However, when you look around the world, in most of other countries, the indigenous people have what's called native rights or indigenous rights and indigenous native title. So, however, the Japanese government is saying that it is not a part of the Japanese laws right now. So at Raporo Nation, we've decided to invite representatives of indigenous groups in various countries, including Canada, Finland, etc., so that they could talk about their indigenous rights to our Raporo Nation members in our nation.
私たちの招待に関しまして、アメリカ合衆国、台湾、カナダ、オーストラリア、フィンランドの先住民の方たちが快く受けていただきました。そこでこの記者会見の場所には、フィンランドのアスラックさん、カナダのラス・ジョーンズさんが同席しております。私たちの先住権に対する思いをこの2人にも共有していただきました。今日はそれで3人でこの記者会見の場に臨んでおります。以上です。よろしくお願いします。
And in response to our invitation, indigenous representatives from the USA, Taiwan, Canada, Australia, and Finland came over to attend the symposium, much to our gratefulness. And today we asked Aslak, Sami from Finland, and Nanjinwas Russ Jones from Haida Nation of Canada are here with me. So the three of us will be entertaining your questions. Thank you very much. And they have already, these two representatives have already heard how Raporo Nation people feel about this issue throughout the symposium as well.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker, Mr. Holmberg, please.
Joo, börja päivi. Mulla on skuvla olema Aslak 4 Aslak ja puhutaan Njorkanis tienuleis. So yes, thank you very much for this opportunity to be here. Just a minor correction to the introduction. At least the Sami Council, we are not Finland-based. We are international organization. So we usually work in 4 different countries. Yes, first of all, thank you for the organizers of the Salmon Symposium. Thank you for the Raporo Ainu-Nation for inviting us, hosting us, and teaching us about your culture and situation. Just a question, will you be interpreting this also? But no, okay, yeah.
He already knows what you're talking about.
Okay, yes, I've given a 1.5 hour lecture there at the symposium, so he knows what I'm gonna say. But yes, so I belong to a salmon fishing people, to the Sami people from the border regions of what is today Finland and Norway, in the Tana River Valley in the north of Europe. And I'm the president of the Sami Council, which is an international, one of the oldest international indigenous peoples organizations. And I got to share my views on our situation with the salmon, which is very concerning, I have to say, even you could say catastrophic. We are now entering a 3rd summer with complete closure of our salmon fishery. And salmon is essential for us, as I believe it is also for the Ainu people. It's foundational part of our culture, our language, our identity. And of course, this has grave impacts for us that we don't have access to this fishery. The salmon stocks have declined rapidly, especially in the past few years, and it's linked to major changes that have come to the Barents Sea due to climate change, and I believe to the availability of the food of the Atlantic salmon. I got to share with the Ainu and other participants about the situation of our rights as they pertain to fishing. And I believe there are a lot of similarities with the Sami and Ainu situations. First of all, with colonization, both of our nations have lost the right to govern our traditional territories and resources. And while the Ainu are able to apply for some special rights to fish for cultural purposes, currently it is impossible for the Sami in my region to legally take part in fishing practices in our home rivers, and we are considered poachers if we do this. This is despite having some major court victories. And I got to share 3 different cases with the participants from Sweden, Finland and Norway. In Sweden they have a major case regarding the right to govern fishing and hunting in the territory of the Sami village. And in Norway and Finland we have cases regarding cultural rights, especially on the fishing rights. The case is that the Supreme Court of Finland has concluded that the closure of the strong restrictions on Sami fishing were a violation of our cultural rights, which are protected by the Constitution. And I believe this is very relevant also for the Ainu, because the Supreme Court of Finland refers to international human rights documents, such as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is also a document that Japan has ratified, and Article 27 is about cultural rights. And also the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is a document that Japan also has to abide by. And as salmon fishing is an essential part of the Sami culture, and as I understand also the Ainu culture, it has to be recognized that the culture has a material basis. So we cannot practice our culture without having the access to these traditional resources. And denying the right to access our traditional resources means denying the right to practice our culture, which is a human rights violation. I see a major difference, though, to the Ainu situation when you compare to our case, because in the Ainu case there is, I understand there is a major commercial fishery that is exploiting the same salmon resources, so there isn't a justification to restrict the Ainu from their fishing rights only by referring to the ecological situation. So this is different back in our river, where the stocks have seriously declined. But yes, I'm glad that we had this opportunity to visit the Raporo Ainu-Nation and share our situations and learn from each other. And I hope it has been useful for the Ainu. And we of course have to keep fighting for our rights. And even if in Finland, Sweden and Norway we have had major Supreme Court victories, then the implementation of these victories is still very much ongoing. So these situations need attention, and we will continue working towards more just and sustainable future. So kiitos ja arigatou gozaimasu.
Okay, thank you. Next up, Mr. Jones.
Singait La. Good day, everyone. My Haida name is my chief's name is Nung Jingwas. I'm a hereditary chief of the Haida Nation on the west coast of Canada. My English name is Russ Jones. I was one of the speakers at the Indigenous Fishing Rights Symposium, and I was talking about our struggle for a recognition of our fishing rights. But I was also there to learn about Ainu culture. One thing came to me from the conference was I was struck by the lack of recognition of indigenous fishing rights in Japan. And I thought this is surprising, particularly given Japan is one of the signatories to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. I observed a number of similarities between our culture and Ainu culture. We both have a strong connection to our land or our territory, our rivers, and our oceans. We're also been very resilient cultures. We're recovering from colonial policies and assimilation policies. we've had in Haida, we have only a few dozen fluent speakers left of the Haida language because of acculturation, but we're bringing back and strengthening those cultural practices. I'm a dancer and a singer, as well as a leader in the Haida Nation. We also in Haida, we've been quite active politically. We have a governance system, an elected council of the Haida Nation that represents all of us, including hereditary chiefs, in negotiations with Canada on resolving access to resources, access to land, and as well as supporting cultural practices. I also learned, some of the differences, between how Indigenous fishing rights are treated in Japan and in Canada. In Canada, the right to fish for food, social, and ceremonial purposes has a priority over commercial and recreational fisheries. It's not a priority over conservation. Conservation, we all have to look after the fish. And this came in part from recognition of Indigenous rights in Canada's Constitution. So in the 1982 Constitution Act, Indigenous people were quite active to ensure that there was a clause, Section 35(1), which recognized and affirmed existing Aboriginal rights in Canada. And it didn't create those rights, and it didn't define them, but it recognized that they existed, and they've continued to be kind of refined and through negotiations and through court processes. There's also an Indigenous right to fish for commercial purposes, and several nations in the west coast of Canada have proven that right in court, and they're still working to implement those rights through negotiations of access to herring, spawn, and kelp, or spring salmon, or other halibut or other species. And while that's going on, there's also negotiations between Canada and other nations about how to implement their fishing rights and find some reconciliation for the loss of territory, the loss of political power, and also the need to rebuild our cultures. There's also in Canada efforts to make Canadian legislation consistent with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So both Canada and the province of British Columbia have passed UNDRIP acts, right, which lay out kind of a work plan for how they will make that legislation and their practices consistent with the international obligations that Canada has committed to under UNDRIP. At the conference, we heard from other groups, and I just wanted to mention Taiwan. We heard about that they have also had their Indigenous rights included recently included in their constitution, and that's really an important step, right, for change, and also its recognition, that from the colonizers that there were cultures and peoples here when you arrived, and there's a need to reconcile, that what's happened over the last century or 2 centuries. We also heard from Australia. Danny Watkins from New South Wales talked about implementation of their rights, which were their fishing rights and their land rights were recognized in a major court decision, the Mabo decision. But he talked to us about the harassment that they're receiving from the state as they try to exercise their Aboriginal rights some 10 years after the Mabo decision, which applied to all of Australia. just in conclusion, I just wanted to say that, Japan is a modern country like Canada and others, and there was just recently the G7 meeting, where our leaders gathered and talked about what we should be doing, as internationally, and how we should be working together. I think Japan needs to make progress on recognition of Raporo Ainu rights, Ainu-Nation's right to fish, and also how to make the UNDRIP obligations concrete and real, so that there isn't the need to go to court to make changes to the. We've heard the allocations that Raporo Nation gets are 100 salmon, and is what they're limited to, and how can that possibly meet the needs of a nation who's existed in this land for thousands of years. And the other thing is just in terms of human rights. Salmon is an important part of the food and needs of nations around the Pacific Rim, from Canada to Japan, and it contributes to food security, and it's a traditional food that's we all have first salmon ceremonies. We give thanks when the fish come back. We have our own ways of looking after that fish as well as preparing it and having it over the winter. So thanks very much for the chance to speak. Digi dalang guslas, skaudagi dalang gatal kil laga. I thank you all for listening.
Okay, thank you very much. We have roughly 30 minutes or so for Q&A, and for those of you who are new to FCCJ, how it works is we will take questions from FCCJ regular members first. We have 2 microphones on the side of the room, so please come up to the microphone, give your name and affiliation, and recognize. Questions? Yes, Richard.
Thank you. Hello, Richard Lloyd Parry from The Times. I had 2 questions for Sashima-san, if I may. The first is to ask whether you could tell us a few more of the particulars of the legal claim that you are making. What exactly is it that you're asking the court for? For example, how many, if you were successful, how many fishermen would be involved, and how many fish would be taken as a result? And the second question is much more general, and it's about Ainu identity in Hokkaido and in modern Japan today. So as I understand it, the numbers of those who identify as Ainu is much fewer than it was in the past, and the number of speakers of the language is also quite few now. So can you tell us then what does it mean? What does it mean to you to be an Ainu in Japan today?
タイムズの記者です。佐島さんに2つご質問があります。はい。1つ目はですね、今の裁判の詳しい内容をもう少し教えてください。つまり、実際に何を国に請求しているのか。例えば、漁業権を受けたとしたら、何人ぐらいの漁師さんが一体何匹ぐらいの、魚を取ることを求めておられるのか、それが1問目です。2問目は後でお伝えします。
現在私たちが裁判で訴えているのは十勝川の河口域で昔の私たちの先祖がそうであったように鮭を取ることです。鮭を取ることによってそれを食料にしたり、それから交易いろいろな取引に使ったりすることを目指しております。私たちの先祖は十勝川河口域に2、3丁ごとにコタンを作って住んでいたと言われております。 ですから、十勝川沿岸にはかなりたくさんのアイヌがいたと思います。その人たちは全員が全員鮭を取って暮らしていたはずです。私たちは今現在、浦幌町内のアイヌ12名ほどで組織しておりますが、浦幌町に住んでいるアイヌ、これはもう血統的にですね、どこまでアイヌでと言っていいのか分かりませんけれども、少なくとも190人以上はいるというふうに私たちはカウントしております。
で何人ぐらいの漁師さんが何匹ぐらいの鮭を取ることを求めておられるか。
私たちは今現在12名で組織されているんですけれども、鮭を取れるということになったら、そうですね、孵化場の再生産、鮭の再生産に使うための鮭マス増殖事業協会の再生産に使う鮭で30万から40万尾取っているんで、私たちは何千匹っていう単位は取れるとは思っております。
Well, through this litigation, what we are trying to obtain is the rights to fish at the mouth of Tokachi River, just like how our ancestors used to catch salmon there. And that's what they used to use for their own consumption as well as for trading. 一丁っていうのは大体何メートル？
一丁っていうのは大体200メートル弱です。
はい、わかりました。So, in the olden days, alongside this Tokachi River, there used to be what's called kotan, Ainu community, every 400 to 600 meters. And so there were lots of Ainu people living alongside the Tokachi River. And all of them, I must say, must have caught salmon in order to make a living. And right now, our organization consists of 12 members in the town of Urahoro. But biologically speaking, it is rather difficult to ascertain if somebody is, how much of the Ainu blood you have to have before you are regarded as Ainu. But nevertheless, I feel there must be more than 190 people in our area. And although there are only 12 members in our organization right now, since the organization that has been working towards the increased production of salmon and trout, since that organization has been catching between 300 to 400,000 salmon for their project, for the hatchery, I feel we should be allowed some 1,000 salmon at least. で、2つ目のshould I translate the, should I speak through the microphone for the translation of
If you
the
could,
question?
please, yes.
Okay, yes. で、2番目の質問なんですけれども、それはもう少し、アイヌのアイデンティティ、つまりアイヌとは何ぞやということについて、アイヌとはどんな人々かということについて伺いたいんですが、今日の日本における、そして特に北海道において、以前とは違った数になってると思うんですよね。自分はアイヌだと思っている人の数は以前よりもずっと減っていると思うんです。そして、またアイヌ語が日常語として話せる人、流暢に話せる人の数も随分と少なくなっていると理解しています。このような日本においてアイヌであるということの意味は どういうことでしょうか。佐島さんにとって自分は、アイヌであるという意味はどういうことでしょうか。
私も含めて、現在、ラポロアイヌネーションの構成員は、親からアイヌの習慣を伝えられている人は一人もおりません。これは北海道各地がそうであるように、アイヌコタンは全く壊滅させられてしまっております。ごく一部、例えば白老町、例えば二部谷、そういったところではアイヌの習慣を細々とつないでいるとは思いますけれども、私たちの十勝川沿岸ではほとんどのアイヌがもうそこからいなくなってしまっております。十勝では帯広周辺、北海道では札幌周辺、私たちの親戚もそうなんですけれども、現在、浦幌町、私たちの地元で暮らしているアイヌは、以前よりは少なくなってきております。私たちは、自分がアイヌであるということをはっきりさせるために、それで自分はアイヌであるというふうに声を上げたのは、私は現在72なんですけれども、年がですね、40を過ぎてからです。私はアイヌであるということを公然と出すようになってからは、それまでは周りで起きているいろいろな差別、それに対して私は隠れるように過ごしておりました。でもですね、なんでこんな目に遭わないのか、なんでこんな目に遭わなければいけないのかっていう思いに駆られまして、そうだよ、私はアイヌだよ、それがどうしたんだというふうに現在は生活しております。私たちの文化は
ごめんなさい。Could interpreter please?
はい。
はい。
Including myself, none of the Raporo Nation members has learned the Ainu way of life from our parents. Nobody. And it is because the Ainu communities have been decimated over decades. And there are only a few spots in Hokkaido where you can find an Ainu community in areas such as Shiraoi or Nibutani. And there, the Ainu customs have been passed on in a feeble manner still. And along Tokachi River, most of the Ainu residents went away from that area to bigger cities or towns such as Obihiro or Sapporo. So in our town, the Ainu people, there are a much smaller number of Ainu people living there now. And I'm 72 now, but it was only after I turned 40 that I started to admit openly that I'm Ainu. And this time too, for this litigation, a part of the reason is to tell the world that I am Ainu, and in order to confirm that. And until I was in my 40s, I turned 40, I was basically hiding away from all sorts of and all forms of discrimination. And one day I thought to myself, why should I live like this? Why should I put up with all of this? So today I tell the world openly that I'm Ainu and what's wrong with it.
Okay, thank you. We've got a number of questions online.
まだ終わってないと思
Oh,
うんです。
okay.
はい。
All right, please. We have a number of questions that we want to get to as well. Thank you.
私は生活と文化は切り離せないと思っております。私たちは文化的には昔のアイヌから完全に切り離された生活を送ってきましたが、現在各地、北海道各地の人 人たちと連絡し合いながら文化を勉強しております。そこで私は現在十勝で鮭を取って生活できるようになったら、今よりも増してアイヌの文化について私たちは手に入れることができると確信しております。今のままだと私たちの文化は博物館に押し込められてやがては消え去ってしまうんじゃないかと思う恐れを抱いております。以上です。
I believe that you cannot separate life from culture. And unfortunately, our way of life has been cut off from the traditional way of Ainu lifestyle and Ainu culture over many years. However, we are trying to revitalize our culture by working together with various Ainu communities across Hokkaido. So we are working together for that, towards that goal. And if we win the fishing rights to catch salmon in Tokachi River, I am certain that it will propel this movement even further, because by being able to catch salmon like our ancestors did, we could gain back our own culture much more readily. If we don't change the status quo, our culture will be only exhibited at museums and nothing more. And eventually that would disappear. That's my fear.
Thank you very much. We have a number of questions that have come in from online. I will take them as they were presented to me in order. So the first question is from Fred Varco, a freelancer. And the first question goes to Sashima-san. And it is, do you see the Japanese government's policies as extensions of the discriminatory policies that existed before Japan's democratic era? In other words, the government's policies to the Ainu, are they the same basically that those that existed before the democratic era were like?
次にフリーランスの記者の方からのご質問です。佐島さんへのご質問です。現在の日本政府の政策というのは、日本が民主化される前からアイヌに対して、取られていた政策の継続だというふうにお考えでしょうか。
明治政府になる前は、私たちの北海道アイヌモシリ、人間の静かな大地っていう意味らしいんですけれども、そこでは私たちアイヌは鹿、鮭などを自由に捕獲して生活しておりました。しかし明治維新になってからは、私たちが川で捕獲すると密猟、山で鹿を取ると密猟、そういったことで私たちの生活の根本から否定されるようになりました。これは第二次世界大戦が終わって、新しい民主化政治とは、ちょっと私も言葉の選び方をちょっとわからないんですけれども、新しい日本政府になってからもその態度は同じです。いろいろな法律を私たちに対して提示してきました。明治時代の旧土人保護法からアイヌ文化振興法、そして2019年最新のアイヌ施策推進法になっても、日本政府の立場は同じなんですけれども、先住民族は北海道にはいるけれども、団体としての先住民族はいない。よって先住権は認める必要がないというように、日本政府は私たちのことを見ていると思います。はい、
Prior to the Meiji period, Ainu-Moshiri, which means the quiet land of people which used to be the Ainu name for today's Hokkaido, was our land, and Ainu people were free to move around there and catch salmon or deer and so on freely. And what changed since the Meiji Restoration is first, the Japanese government decided that if Ainu caught fish, that would be poaching, and if the Ainu caught deer, that would be also poaching and illegal. So that way, the Japanese government denied our way of life completely. And after the World War II, and I guess what you're referring to as democratization, I'm not sure if that's the proper term for that, but since the new type of Japanese government came in, this stance remained the same. The Japanese government came up with various different laws regarding the Ainu, and the one of the oldest ones is the former Aboriginal law, or former, in direct translation of the Japanese, the former savage law almost. And then after that, the Japanese government came up with a law to promote the Ainu culture. And now in 2019, they again came up with a new law to implement various policies regarding the Ainu people. However, throughout all of this, all of these different names for different laws, the attitude of the Japanese government has remained the same. They are still saying that, sure, there are some indigenous people living in Hokkaido, but they do not exist as a group or as groups. Therefore, there is no ground for recognizing indigenous rights. That is their stance.
Okay, thank you. And the second question is for, I think, any of the three speakers who wishes to answer it. It is, how do you expect national governments to reconcile the ancient customs and boundaries of tribal people within modern expectations and national borders? Would any of the three speakers like to take a shot at that question?
2番目の質問ですけれども、これはどなたに答えていただいても結構です、お三方の。で、質問の内容ですが、今日の世界にあって、そして今日の国境、今日の世界の在り方の中で、かつての伝統的な古い、慣習なり、何なりをどのように、よみがえらせるといいますか、どこでそれを譲歩し合うことができるとお考えですかという質問です。
Yes, I could give a try at that. We all live in a modern world. We admit that, but we all have history as well, and there's diversity in our populations. You know, in Canada, we're about 5% of the national population has Indigenous ancestry, either First Nation, Métis, or Inuit. And in the rural communities, like in Haida, our population, we might be 45% of the population living on our islands. And the treaty negotiation process is meant to resolve those kinds of issues, right, between, you know, what we do in the modern day. But I think it's important to recognize that, too, in Canada, it's recognized that Indigenous rights can evolve. You know, they're not frozen in time. If you just fished in a certain way in a certain place, it doesn't mean that's the only way you can fish. You know, you adapt, you know, to and it is a changing environment. We realize we all have to have to adapt. And then in terms of boundaries, so I think it's Canada takes that responsibility to negotiate with individual First Nations. There's more than 40 First Nations in the province of British Columbia, and they're able to work out different arrangements with them, and as well respecting kind of the need for self-determination and self-governance. Thank you.
Yes,
I
please.
can briefly add, well, it is these modern states that have, together with Indigenous peoples' representatives, come up with tools for solving these issues. And the most clear document on this is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which gives quite a detailed guidance on how do you implement Indigenous peoples' rights in a modern state system. So, thank you.
Sashima-san, do you wish to comment?
カナダでは会議でおっしゃったようなことなんですけど、そんな例えば魚の釣り方でも昔の伝統的なものしか許さないとかいいんじゃなくて、現代のもので現代のやり方で許されるとか、それから今エスラックさんがおっしゃったのは国連の先住権の宣言がその良いガイダンスになるのではないかということです。
質問のちょっと趣旨が。
もう2人で答えられたかもしれない。
Is that okay? All right, very good. Okay, moving on back to the floor. Yes, go ahead.
Nishimura with Hokkaido Shimbun. Thank you for coming today. I understand that the salmon, the access of the salmon resources is the common issue for any of your community. So I'm asking my question to the two foreign guests. If you achieve the right of catching salmon, are you going to charge on the taking the full sovereignty on the land, on your land? I'm asking this because it is theoretically possible. And next question is to Sashima-san. What actually is the achievement of this weekend's international symposium in your hometown? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Well, I want to refer to the Supreme Court ruling from Sweden with the Kirjas case, where the court recognized that the Sami village has a stronger right to govern their territories and fishing and hunting in their area. And this right is stronger than the right of the state to do that. And I do think that the similar principles and the legal arguments apply to other Sami villages as well, including the Tetnu region, which used to consist of many different Sami villages, or Sida as we call them. So yes, I do believe that when you look at the historic use and the rights accumulated through that use, then it is the Sami people who have the right to govern fishing in this region. So I'll keep it short. Thanks. Well, I'm thinking that as a topic of this gathering was revolving around fishing, but so I kept my answer to that. But of course, it applies more widely to the use of the areas. But I'm not quite sure if sovereignty is the right word in this context with many different actors. But yes, thanks.
Okay. Before that, Mr. Go ahead.
Yes, just in terms of implementing fishing rights, I mean, it's typically done on a very place-based and local basis, right? And it's based, and there are places where we fished for since time immemorial, right? And in terms of food sovereignty, right? The way it works in Canada, right, is our fishery has the priority for food, social, and ceremonial purposes over other fisheries. And if there's fish remaining after that, then commercial and recreational fisheries can benefit from it. And I guess also, that fish is very important in the community, right? right? There's a lot of sharing of fish. Elders who can't fish, younger people, go fishing, and it's part of our events like potlatches or feasts as well. So, salmon is a very important part of that.
佐島さんへのご質問は、今回のシンポジウムで成就できたことは何だとお考えですかということです。
私たちが5カ国から来る先住民の方たちから話を聞いて、私たちが先住権について勉強し、そして日本の皆様にも今の日本の先住権に対するこの情勢を理解してもらう、そのことを目的にこのシンポジウムを開催したんですけれども、5カ国からの方たちが私たちの土地に来てバスから降りてきたとき、私は本当にこんな嬉しいことはないと思いました。で、5カ国から来た方たちのお話を聞いてびっくりしたのは、私たちと違って先住権をすでに確保してそれを運用している、なんていい状況の国だろうと思ったんですけれども、やはりそれぞれの国で憲法にその先住民のことを書かれていたり、原住民基本法で先住民のことが書かれていたりしているにもかかわらず、その国々で実際的に法律を運用する末端の為政者ですね、たちからいろいろな妨害を受けて、現在も戦っている状況にあるということが、理解できました。それで私たちは先住権をなんとか自分たちの手に入れれるように頑張っているんですけれども、世界の先住民の人たちはその上でなおかつ自分たちがもっといい状況になれるように戦っているんだということを理解できて、本当に勉強になりました。はい。
The purpose of this symposium was to hear from various indigenous representatives from 5 different countries and learn about indigenous rights. And by sharing that information among us, we were hoping to spread the information to other Japanese who are non-indigenous to enhance their understanding. However, when our foreign guests came out of the bus, when they arrived in our village, I was so touched. I felt nothing will make me happier than this. And we felt that since in the countries our guests came from, because the indigenous rights have been already confirmed, I thought they were exercising their indigenous rights very smoothly and happily. However, our finding was quite different when we heard their stories throughout the symposium. Despite the fact that their indigenous rights are written into their constitution or in the basic laws regarding indigenous peoples, when it comes to the implementation of such laws, the people who actually come in contact with indigenous people are not in full understanding of the indigenous rights, to put it mildly. And in fact, many of the indigenous guests told us how they've been harassed by the compliance officers, or they've been prevented from fishing, etc. So they're still in their struggle in order to have such laws that are supposed to protect their legitimate rights to be actually implemented. So this is what we understood very much this weekend, and that was very, very useful for us.
Okay, thank you. At this point, we only have about a minute left. I'd like to ask the three speakers, is it okay to go over time, maybe stick around another 10 or 15 minutes? We still have some excellent questions from our members.
あと1分だったんですが、とてもいい質問があるので、少し10分、15分伸ばしてもよ
Okay,
ろしいですか。
very good. So if that's the case, I would like to go back to an online question. This is from Ilgin Yormulaz, BBC Turkish freelance journalist. She asks, countries like China follow a rule-by-custom policy toward their ethnic minorities, keeping them autonomous in their domestic affairs, but still governed by a central government. Japan is a different case, but would it make sense to adopt a highly decentralized policy toward the Ainu people and create autonomous regions, which will allow the Ainu to decide how to use their over and underdeveloped land resources? This question is for Sashima-san.
はい。BBC などに寄稿しています、記者さんからの質問です。例えば中国のような国では少数民族、を統治するために、自治区みたいなものを作りながら、実際は、中央の政府がコントロールを持つというようなやり方がなされていると思いますけれども、例えば日本において、アイヌの自治区みたいなものを作って、もっと中央集権を外して、そしてアイヌ自治区を作って、アイヌの人々がどのように土地や自分たちの自然資源を使うかを決定するというようなことを行うというような案は、どうお感じになりますか？そういう案については。
現在、私たちに対して自治区のような体制を作ってくれたら、それはそれに越したことはないとは思いますけれども、そうすると今度私たちが現在の私たちの周りにある自然に対してより節度を持ってより自分たちを厳格に規律して立ち向かっていかなければならないような気がします。ただ私たちは現在の周りの自然に対して自由に振る舞うことが全くできないでおります。しかしもしそれができるようになったら、当然のように私たちは自分たちを律するばかりでなく、自分たちの周りの人たちに対しても、そういうような厳格な規律を持って向かい合っていくような社会ができればいいなと思ってはおります。
自然と向かい合っていく。
はい。
If such an autonomous region was to be created for us, that would be ideal in my way of thinking. But that would give us an enormous responsibility to control ourselves, control our attitudes towards the protection of the natural surroundings. And not just us, but other people around us should be educated to deal with the natural environment in a controlled and disciplined manner.
Okay, thank you. Are there other questions from the floor, regular members? Okay, if not, we've got a couple more online questions, if I may. This one comes in from Motoko Rich of the New York Times. It's for Sashima-san. And the question is the Japanese government trying to restrict Ainu rights on the basis of sustainability and ecological preservation, or does the Japanese government provide a different justification? And why are salmon rights, fishing rights, important to the Ainu? Is it mainly about the preservation of historical rights, or is salmon fishing currently important to Ainu culture?
これはニューヨーク・タイムズの記者さんからのご質問です。日本政府はアイヌの人々の権利を制限する上で、その理由として、例えば自然保護ということを出してきているんでしょうか、あるいは別の理由でアイヌの権利を狭めているのでしょうか。それが一つで、もう一つはですね、なぜ鮭というものは アイヌの人々にとってそれだけ大切なものなのでしょうか。それは歴史的な権利ということでしょうか。それとも現状において鮭を取るということがとても大事なのでしょうか。
最初の質問に対する答えなんですけれども、私たちに対して鮭を取るなという規則を作ったのは、全く私たちアイヌに対する尊敬も何もない侮蔑的な理由だと思います。というのは、日本国内では伝統的に川で鮭を取っている地区があります。ところが北海道では私たちは伝統的な文化を保存するためだけだったら200本までは取っていいよという他の地区とは全く違う規則でもって私たちを抑え込んでおります。
日本で今も川で取ってるところあるんですか？
はい、日本で今でも川で魚を取っているのは実際には新潟県なんですけれども、実際にその例はあります。それから2つ目の質問ですけれども、私たちにとって鮭はどのぐらい大事かという意味だと思いますけれども、私たちは鮭のことは神がくれた魚、鮭自身は神様ではないんですけれども、それはしかも同じで、私たちの目の前に神が与えてくれた魚として鮭はあるというふうに私たちには伝えられております。私たちはそれを食料にして、料理方法も何十種類もある料理方法で利用しますし、それを取って他の地区との間の交易のためにも使っておりましたし、あとそうですね、まあそういったことですね。あとちょっと頭がまとまらないんですけれども、
はい、お願いしますね。The fact that the Japanese government prohibited the Ainu people from catching salmon was an entirely disdainful attitude on their part, total lack of respect, because there are some areas in other parts of Japan where catching salmon in a river is allowed. One such example is in Niigata Prefecture. However, in Hokkaido, we are allowed to catch only up to 200 salmon, only for ceremonial purposes. So, to answer your second question about the importance of salmon to the Ainu people, we regard salmon as a fish that was given by God or gods, just as we regard deer as an animal given by our gods. And so in that sense, salmon is a very, very special fish for us, and there are dozens and dozens of ways to cook it. And we've always used salmon and as food as well as a trading item throughout centuries.
Okay, thank you. And we have one more question in from online. This is from Etienne Balmer of Agency France Presse, AFP. And it's a question to Sashima-san, but I'm going to use the moderator's prerogative and add one for our other guests as well. His question is, what is the current stand of your legal struggle with the Japanese government? When do you expect a first court decision on this issue? And are you optimistic or not? And my question to our foreign guests is also, what do you see your own people doing to help the Raporo Ainu-Nation in their struggle? For example, do you think they might have a case? You mentioned the indigenous peoples the UN declaration. Would this be something that you would bring up with the UN, or you would help the Raporo and Ainu-Nation? Any advice for them? Okay.
AFP の記者の方からのご質問です。今、日本を政府を相手取って裁判を起こしていらっしゃいますけれども、最初の判決が出るのは大体いつぐらいだと想定しておられますか。そしてその判決については楽観的に感じていらっしゃいますかというのが佐島さんへのご質問です。で、あとの2人には今回このシンポジウムに参加されてどのような形でラポロネーションの戦いをサポートできるとお考えでしょう。そしてまた国連の先住民族の権利についての宣言などがありますが、例えば国連にこういったことを持ち込むなどということも可能性として考えておられるんでしょうか。
私たちの裁判はこれ続いているんですけれども、その結果がどうなるかは全く予想できないでおります。裁判の最初についた判事は私たちの裁判について、国と北海道は私たちが過去明治より前は自由に鮭をまたは鹿を取っていたという事実に関しては知らずと言ってるんですよ。それに対して最初についた判事はそのことについてイエスかノーか答えませんかというふうに裁判の中で私たちにおっしゃったんですね。それで私は本当にこれはいい流れになるんではないかなと思ったんですけれども、その判事がすぐ交代しまして、それでついに立った判事はこの私たちの国と北海道との間に言い合いについて水かけ論という言葉を使ったんですね。それで私はちょっとがっかりしまして、この裁判はこれは生半可ではいかないな、なんとかしなければならないということで今回の、国際シンポジウムも考えたんですけれども、いつ裁判が終わるのか、この裁判が私たちにとってどういう結果になるのかは私は全く分かりません。
鮭や鹿を自由に取っていたということは知らずというのは、
はい、そうで知らずというのはそうであるともないとも国も北海道も言ってないんです。はい。
As for the results of the litigation we are in, I really have no idea. However, the first judge who was assigned to our case said that neither the national government nor the Hokkaido government is not clear about whether or not the Ainu people freely fished salmon or hunted deer prior to the Meiji period. They said, the judge said, there is, should we イエスかノーか答えませんかと佐島さんたちにお聞きになったんです。
その会場にですね、国と北海道に対して
答えませんかと言ったんです。And the judge appealed to the national government and Hokkaido government to answer yes or no regarding this question. So I thought, well, this is a good beginning. However, the judge was replaced soon after. And the new judge who came in said, 国と北海道の水かけの水かけのこちら側と国北海道のこっちのその間の水かけ。The second judge called our argument against the national government and Hokkaido government as sort of a useless argument where there is no winner, so to speak, or loser. And so that showed me that this is not going to be an easy litigation. So I felt we should do something about this, and that's a part of the reason why we organized the symposium we held this weekend. So I have no idea how this litigation is going to end up.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Well, I can say that Sami people do have a lot of experience on taking cases to international courts, and it is after the national or the domestic measures have been exhausted, and if you still consider that your rights are being violated, that's the time to take the case to international courts, such as the Human Rights Committee. So, of course, if it was so, I mean, of course, we hope for the best for your national court case, and hopefully you will get your rights respected. But if it was so that you would fail to get your rights respected in the domestic court system, then I do believe that we could provide some advice, at least, on how our experiences have been in taking cases to the international court system.
And maybe I'll just add, I think we have a lot of experience with implementing rights when the rights aren't recognized. And, a good example was the protected area in southern Guayhanas, which were Haida were concerned about logging in the area. And eventually the area was protected by Canada, and there was an agreement negotiated for joint management of the area that's been jointly managed now for more than 30 years. And so we can provide, some of that kind of experience that we've had developing also land use plans for logging in the area, so they're more ecologically based, right? And marine use plans and work establishing marine protected areas. Those are all areas where Indigenous people have a very strong role, right? So that because it is looking at future generations, so that we're passing on to those future generations a healthy environment.
Okay, with that, we shall conclude. I'd like to thank all of our guests for appearing today. Thank you for the interpreter for doing a wonderful job. And thank you all very much for coming, and thanks to everyone who passed questions online. That concludes today's FCCJ press conference. Thank you.